But William, thank you so much for being here. We're so excited to have you here with us today.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to talk about things that one is interested in. I guess I'll say that, as Carrie mentioned, I just retired. I came to Reed in 1987, so I guess I just missed any of you, but I've certainly enjoyed teaching here. And my training was as a historian of the Middle Ages, the Western European Middle Ages. And more recently, I've been working on the modern interest in the Middle Ages. And as you'll see in the course of what I'm going to say, both of those, the Middle Ages and the more recent interest in the Middle Ages, figure into what I'm going to be talking about. Just to say, I was asked to talk about some books that Reed acquired during the time I was here. And so I'm going to present a couple of those books, maybe as many as 3. We'll see how it goes. This is not a talk that has a thesis. It's really a presentation of these materials and a little exploration of why I think these materials are interesting and important. But as I say, it's not like a humanities lecture with a thesis. But I'm happy to try and answer any questions you have either during the course of what I say or at the end about the Middle Ages or about the role of these objects in teaching. Just before I get to the books, I want to say one important sort of precondition. It's a tradition to thank donors, but in this case, without the donors, this wouldn't be happening. So as some of you may know, about 30 years ago, right around 1990, 2 trustee families, Sue and Ed Cooley and John and Betty Gray, gave a large amount of money to Reed, and specifically for the purpose of integrating art history and humanities. So it was a quite focused gift, and it did various things. It created 2 positions in art history, 2 faculty positions, which meant that each of the humanities courses could be staffed with an art historian. It endowed a lecture series that's been quite active. And one of the things it did was it provided a quite large amount of money for books to be purchased for the library. And in some senses, the amount of money was really too large. It allowed us to sort of buy every modern work of art history that we might possibly want for our teaching and research. But beyond that, it then became the question, there was more money than that. And the question was what to do with that money. It didn't make sense for us to buy every European and Asian and Middle Eastern periodical because none of our students or us could read them. So what we decided to do was to buy books that, including potentially quite rare books, that we could use basically as primary research objects for our teaching. And so I'm going to be talking about 3 manuscripts that were bought with those funds. I should say that my colleague Geraldine Andrzejek in sculpture has used the same funds to assemble a really amazing collection of 20th century and 21st century books made by artists. Really a beautifully curated collection. So I think these funds have been put to pretty good use by us. The other thing I will say just in introduction is that it's in a lot of ways unfortunate that this is going on via Zoom. The very reason to buy these books was precisely because these are physical objects. They are not simply flat images on a screen. As you all know, books have physical characteristics, and those characteristics engage the sense of vision, of course, but they also engage the sense of touch, the sense of smell, etc. And so the whole goal, in some sense, of Reed owning these books was not to have the college have an impressive collection of books, but to have the college have physical objects that we and our students could work with. And unfortunately, we can't do that. So those are the 2 preconditions. I'm going to share my screen now and start talking about the first of the medieval books we bought. So let me just do that. Is that, you're seeing a slide that looks like a book? Great. This is the first of the medieval books we bought. And I begin with this slide where you see the cover of the book and then what you would see if you were to open the cover, namely the inside of the front cover. And you can see these two book plates, one from Robert Hoe and one from T.J. Coolidge. So we're both American collectors of the 19th and 20th century. And there's not a whole lot special about this image, it strikes me. You would not know much about this book by looking at the cover or looking inside the front cover. And to me, this is actually one of the real advantages about us having medieval books. As a medievalist, as a historian of the Middle Ages, one of my great problems is trying to get students to engage, be not interested in, but to understand a world that was incredibly different from our own. I was trained very much in a tradition that looks at the Middle Ages as distant, chronologically distant, socially distant, theologically distant, etc. And so I spend a lot of my time bridging gaps. And one of the great things about books, and in this case, illustrated books, is we all know what they are. And I think this helps a lot in the teaching. For me, my manuscripts class is my most successful class because while I certainly don't play down the differences that exist between us and the Middle Ages, students looking at a medieval manuscript know a huge amount about it because they understand how books work, they understand how illustration works, they understand how texts work. This is probably especially true at Reed, which I think is a bookish place. It's not an accident that I've collected these books. Jerry Andrzejczyk has collected artist books. So I begin with this slide because I think it shows in some senses the familiarity of this material. This is what we would see if we turned one more page. And here we certainly get into the question of unfamiliarity and distance. And I guess I'll say a couple of things about what you're seeing here and more generally about the books we're going to be looking at. All the books we're going to be looking at are manuscripts. So, and what that means literally, it's from the Latin manuscripta, meaning written by hand. So we're looking at books here that were written by hand and in this case also decorated and painted by hand. So we're dealing with books that are different from the normal book we experience, which comes in the age of printing or in digital images. In talking about, I think you can see this, but in talking about how this book might be different from a printed book, the two things I would point most to once are the coloristic richness, especially in early printing, so Gutenberg's Bible and onwards. It was very, very, very difficult to print in more than one color, so that when printing came in the middle of the 15th century, there was a stripping down of the coloristic richness of books. Again, you can see this page is extremely coloristically rich. The other thing that was very difficult for printing to do was to go outside the rectangular text block. And again, you can see here that on the right, there is a rectangular text block, but it's been expanded and cut into in various ways via the decorated border. This is a letter, capital letter O here. And then on the left, obviously, we have an image that's totally outside the text block. So there was a certain kind of freedom on the page that the manuscript provided and that printing lost, if you will. This is usually the medievalists' defense of the manuscript against printing, that a huge amount was gained via the invention of printing, but a huge amount was also lost. So what you're looking at here is what you would see if you opened the book. So it's as all these books we're looking at are the kind of books you and I deal with when we deal with a book. They're a codex with a spine and cut edge pages. So there's a left-hand page and a right-hand page. And the opening was a very, very, very important unit in the Middle Ages. It's basically the basic unit of viewing of the book. It's what you see, right? You see 2 pages at a time. And you don't, and it was understood as a conceptual unit as well. And we can see that, for example, in this case, what this book is a kind of text we call a processional. And what that means is it has the texts that are necessary for, in this case, nuns to do what their duty as nuns and engage in some of the major Christian feasts. So what we're in this book and in this monastery, one of the most important feasts of the year was relatively minor Christian feast in general, the so-called Purification of the Virgin. This is the moment when, after the birth of Christ, the Virgin Mary, according to Jewish practice, came into the temple, I believe 40 days after the birth, to have herself purified from the blood spilled during the birth, and also to present her child to the priest in the high temple. According to Jewish practice at the time, the firstborn son, which Jesus was owed to the priesthood, but typically could be redeemed for a gift. And that's exactly what you see going on here. So on the left, Mary is presenting the baby Jesus to the high priest. Joseph is kneeling in the foreground. And in the back center, you can see a woman here with some birds in a basket. That would have been the offering to the temple that was going to redeem Jesus. I mentioned that this was not a very important Christian feast in the grand scheme. It's not Christmas, it's not Easter, it's not Pentecost. It was very important to nuns, however, because, and religious figures in general, because they saw it as a mirror of their own lives. So just as the Christ was offered to the church, the temple in this case, they had offered their lives to the church. So they saw this as a kind of mirror in the Gospels of their own life. And so for these nuns, this would have been an important feast, and especially because not only is Jesus being offered, but because Mary is also coming and being purified. So there's a gender role here. The nuns presumably would have looked to Mary as a certain kind of model. There's a lot of information on this page, and I will only say that the reason we know it was made for nuns is because the style of decoration here on the right is very, very peculiar for the period and very, very characteristic. And it allows us to say that this manuscript, to know that this manuscript was made in a monastery at a place called Poissy, right outside Paris. The suburban Paris trains go there. Poissy was a monastery that had been founded, or convent that had been founded at the very end of the 13th century by the King of France in honor of his predecessor as King of France, Louis IX, who was sainted. So we're dealing with one of the most prestigious sort of high-end religious establishments of the French Middle Ages. And that's reflected in this book. It means that there are something like 30 of these Poissy processionals still extant. And what that must mean is that every nun at Poissy had one. These were often very, very, very rich women, either unwed daughters of aristocratic families or widows of aristocratic marriages who would join the monastery. So we're dealing here with a quite high-end book, and you can see that down here. This is a coat of arms. It's not an identified coat of arms, but what it means is that the person for whom this book was made was a nun of Poissy, but also somebody who had a coat of arms, which would have put her extremely high up in the medieval aristocratic hierarchy. I'm not going to go through every page, but this is what you would see if you turn the first page, and then the image on the right comes a little later, and you'll see. Obviously, you'll recognize the musical staves. Again, the Christian liturgy, as you probably know, in the Middle Ages was very much a musical liturgy, and because this is telling the nuns what to do and what to say for these major Christian feasts, it has music in it. On the right, the text that the nuns would sing is in the black with the staves. You'll see there's a lot of red writing in this page. And I chose this page because what those red writings are is quite unusual. They're the stage instructions for the celebration of the Christian rite. So this here says sorores in coro cantet. The sisters in the choir sing this. Sorores in medio cori. So this is what the sisters in the middle of the choir sing. Excuse me. Here, sorores ante gradus alta voce dicant. So the sisters standing in front of the steps to the altar say in a high voice. And these stage instructions point to one of the reasons why I thought this was a good book for us to acquire. We bought this book at auction, and it's because it's got a lot of stuff going on in it. It's obviously, it's obviously an authentic medieval manuscript, and so it represents things like being made by hand, being painted on vellum. But it also, for me, is in some senses almost the perfect liberal arts college manuscript. It's got social history in terms of this monastery. It's got gender history in the fact that these are nuns. It's got music. The fact that we have these stage instructions means that we can, in some senses, reinvigorate our understanding of the medieval mass in ways that I think we couldn't with other books. So this book seemed to have a lot of stuff going on in it, which was one of the reasons that it was a book that we targeted for purchase, and indeed were able to purchase. So two more openings from the manuscript, and I show them to you here only because they illustrate very nicely the range of possibilities of decoration. So on the left, we see a full-page miniature like the one we were looking before at the Purification of the Virgin. Facing that, we have a text decorated with quite elaborate border. If you turn the page again, you get this much simpler border here. And this much simpler border is generated because an important text break comes here, right? One text ends, a new text begins here, amen, amen. And so when there's a kind of large capital letter, it gets a border. On the right, we have no border at all. And this is a principle that we call the hierarchy of decoration, which is that the importance of the page is indicated by how elaborate and extensive the decoration is. And this is a useful feature to know about because it would have been used by a medieval reader just as it's used by me, a modern art historian. The nuns too had to find their place in the book, and because of this hierarchy of decoration, they could immediately identify where the most important sections were, the second most important sections, the third most important sections. Sometimes the hierarchy can be incredibly attenuated, but this is a principle that was used throughout the Middle Ages, in order to give shape to the book, they didn't typically use page numbers, for example. So there were these are basically all finding aids for the users. They all would have been more or less literate in Latin if they were using books, but nonetheless, it's very helpful to have information about that helps one gather where one is.
William, we have a question from an audience member.
Great.
Can you repeat the name and date of that manuscript?
Yes, well, I don't think I ever said the date, which is, so the manuscript is from Poissy, Poissy, and it's a kind of manuscript called a processional. Before I get to the date, let me just say that all of the manuscripts that we've bought have been fully photographed and are available through the Reed Digital Collections, and they're fully available to you just as they are to me. So if you go to the Reed Digital Collections website, you will find links to all of them. So, you know, and they're accessible to anybody outside the Reed community as well. One of the goals, certainly, of an institution owning books like this is to make them as accessible as possible. This book is it's known to the people who are interested in Poissy processionals. I alerted them to it, so it shows up in the books on Poissy processionals, but we want to make it available to anyone. In terms of date, I should have mentioned that we don't have a precise date, but we can tell from basically the style of the images in this book is characteristic of France, northern France, in the very early 16th century. So that's worth pointing out, by the way, that the very early 16th century is 50 years after Gutenberg. So this is a book that is well after the introduction of printing, and there was plenty of printing in Paris, which is where this book would have been made in or near Paris. So we're looking at a book that shows that printing, whatever it did not immediately kill off the manuscript. And that was partly for exactly the reasons I pointed out, that the manuscript could do certain things that the printed book couldn't do, especially for an audience that was used to things like coloristic richness, border decorations, things like that. So yeah, the first couple of decades of the 16th century, which was a moment when a lot of these processionals were made. There are probably 10 other Poissy processionals of the same date. Just want to show you two other pages from this book that I think are interesting for different reasons. These are two more of the full page miniatures. There aren't a whole lot of full page miniatures in this book. I think there are 5, which means that you will have seen 4 of them. The image on the left, many of you will recognize, is the Last Supper. So in this book, it's understood as the moment, the Last Supper, according to the Gospels, Christ said, he took the bread and the wine, which were there because it was a Passover Seder, but he said, break this bread to remember me, drink this wine to remember me. And he actually said, the bread is my body, the wine is my blood. So for Christianity, the Last Supper is an event that is repeated in every Christian mass, where the priest, in imitation of Christ, turns the bread and the wine of the mass into the body and blood of Christ. So it's an event of great significance in Christian ritual, and so it's not surprising that it gets an image in this processional, because the nuns would have been mass all the time. But I want to call your attention to this section down here, which oops, sorry. Sorry. I was trying to blow it up, but I think you can probably see it's been scratched out, and it's been scratched out intentionally. And frankly, this is a mystery as to why it's been scratched out and what was scratched out. Gay Walker, my my colleague, who for a long time was head of special collections, has looked at this very carefully under magnification, and she believes that this was a pig. It's a little hard to imagine what a pig was doing at the Last Supper. More likely would have been a dog. One time sometimes sees feast scenes with dogs sort of lounging around, and it's possible that the dog was sort of painted by rote. The painter thought, oh, banquet scene, let's have a dog. And then somebody said, no, that's not really appropriate for the Last Supper. But it's a puzzle, and it's the kind of puzzle that, theoretically could tell us a lot. I mean, somebody went to the trouble of painting it in, and then somebody went to the trouble of scraping it out. So that's one of the features that was appealing about this book. The image on the right is another of the full-page miniatures, and it shows 3 episodes from the life and the death of Saint Catherine. Here she's disputing pagan philosophers about her religion. She's defending Christianity, and they're defending paganism. Here there's an attempt to kill her by in various ways that was unsuccessful. And finally, Catherine she could not be killed in any other way. She was broken on a wheel and finally beheaded. And I show you this page only because, as I mentioned, we have lots and lots of other Poissy processionals, and lots of them, they in fact all have the first image you saw of the Purification of the Virgin. They all have this Last Supper image. None of them have an image of the martyrdom of St. Catherine. St. Catherine was not an important saint at the monastery of Poissy. There were many important saints there, but she was not one of them. So it's very, very likely that this book was made for a nun whose name was Catherine. This would have been a relatively common practice, that you wanted to pay special commemoration to the saint whose name you held. So that information, that this book was probably made for a nun named Catherine, combined with the information of this coat of arms, should allow us actually to identify the patron of this book. That's a kind of research that is, it would probably take a trip to France to do that research, but we would know enough about the monastery of Poissy to identify all the nuns named Catherine. There are probably 100 nuns at Poissy at the time, so not many of them would have been named Catherine. And the coat of arms would allow us to confirm that. Again, that's not been done, but it is something that could be done.
We have several questions that have popped up for you.
Sure.
One was Poissy and I'm going to butcher this because it's been a long time since my high school French, a béguinage?
It was not a béguinage. So a béguinage, as I understand it, would have been for, in some senses, lay women who were involved with, who were imitating the monastic life in some ways. Now, Poissy was a Dominican convent, and again, of the ultra prestigious level. And so, I should say there are these 30 Poissy processionals, and how did this come on the market? It probably came on the market because this was a book made for a rich woman who was a nun at Poissy at some point, and when she died, this book likely went back to her family. And which meant that it became available basically for the market. That's one possible and probably the most likely way this book would have gotten onto the market, that it basically was a book that stayed, it was very briefly in the monastery, but it stayed in private hands.
Another question is, how many of these manuscripts would have been made?
So that's a difficult question. It looks like, from the fact that we've got all these Poissy processionals, that theoretically every nun had her own. The size of them, they would have needed this information. So that would make 100 poissy processionals, let's say in 1510. That seems not impossible. There's something like 100,000, maybe more, extant medieval manuscripts. Now, the Middle Ages went on for 1,000 years. Not all of them are richly decorated, but we're dealing with a period in which books were very, very, very important. You may think of the Dark Ages, and there might have been some dark moments, but if you also think that the beginning of the Gospel of John, so the absolutely fundamental Christian text, begins, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." That meant that the Word had an unbelievably high status in Christianity, and manuscripts were a primary form of the rendering of the Word. So there are a lot of medieval manuscripts, and they're probably, as I say, is probably the case that every nun at Poissy had one. It's certainly possible that not every nun at Poissy had a book this fancy. This is a quite fancy book. It's got full page miniatures. It's got elaborate hierarchy of decoration. It's got a lot of gold. This would have been a luxury item.
Can you speak to some of the materials that would have been used to create some of the more vibrant colors that we're seeing?
Yeah, I can. I have to say, this is a slight blind spot in me intellectually. These are all tempera, aside from the gold. These are some of which here is gold leaf. There's both gold leaf over here and gold paint on the left. So these are all tempera pigments, and they are either vegetable based or mineral based. And I confess that we know a lot about this. We know it based on medieval recipes, and we know it based on modern scientific analysis. So we know a lot about what these pigments were, and it was, as I say, it's an intellectual blind spot to me. I can right after we're done, I can put in the chat. There are many excellent books on it, but one occurs to me that's very much about what pigments are made from.
And then final question. Monastery is usually used when the residents are male, convent when the residents are female. You seem to use them interchangeably. Was Poissy a convent or monastery? And if it was a convent, were the calligraphers of the processional female?
So you're right. I think that Poissy was a female convent. Medievalists sometimes do what you say and separate monasteries and convents. A lot of times they also talk about the monastic life, which means both monks and nuns. The question of who made this book is an excellent one. I don't know what your view of the Middle Ages is, but many people's view of the Middle Ages is that all these books were made by monks. That was the general rule of thumb, is that was true for, let's say, from the 5th to the 12th century, that monks were the major makers of books. Starting in the 12th century and progressively going onwards, manuscript making became big business. Population increased, literacy increased, they needed more manuscripts, and it became primarily, at least at this level, a lay enterprise. So these are professional bookmakers. Paris had a huge professional bookmaking trade. So the supposition would generally be that these books were made by professional bookmakers. And the page on the left, I mentioned that this is how we date the book based on how this page looks. This page looks like every other high-level illumination made in Paris around this period. So that surely, and those are books being made for all different kinds of audiences, this page was surely painted by a professional book illuminator. I also mentioned that the reason we know that this book was made in Poissy is actually because of this decoration, which is a characteristic of Poissy manuscripts. It appears in lots and lots of Poissy manuscripts, and it's also archaic vis-a-vis this. It's out of date. This page has to a trained eye, this page is funny looking because the right-hand side looks to be of like a century earlier in date than the left-hand side. Again, this happens in Poissy manuscripts all the time. Some scholars, most scholars, in fact, think that's because the nuns painted the borders on the right, and the nuns were kind of, frankly, backwards or unprofessional, at least, is the supposition. That could be right. For me, the reason the pages on the right look like this is because for me, it's a kind of conscious archaism. And this goes exactly to Poissy's function. So I say Poissy was like it was the most elite convent in France, and it had close ties to the highest French families. And to me, what's actually going on here on the right is that this book is trying to look like books made sort of in the glory days of the French monarchy, which were and of Poissy, which were somewhat in the past. Now, that could be done by the nuns of Poissy, but obviously you could tell a professional illuminator, look, make something that looks like this. That's what professional illuminators know how to do. So I think the question of who made this book is an excellent one and is a real question for research. And again, I'm not really satisfied with the argument, oh, it's not very good, these pages on the right, that must be the nuns. I mean, I don't, I think that frankly that's a gender stereotype, and maybe a stereotype about what professionals can do versus non-professionals that I don't think is justified. So the question is a really good one and is a really good question for research, and one that would be worth pursuing. I want to just quickly, we bought another medieval book, but I actually want to show you just very quickly and end a third book we bought, because it's something quite different. You're looking at it, it looks sort of like the others. It's got a nice leather cover and clasps. But as soon as you open this book up, you would, depending on how big your screen is, you can probably see that something different is going on here. You can probably read that it says Christmas Mass, and then the priest at the foot of the altar, ... And two things to say about this immediately. One is that it's in English, unlike Latin. So it would have been unusual for a Christmas Mass in the Middle Ages to be written in English. And the other thing to say about it is you probably notice that it's in more or less modern English. There's a saith there, but this is not Chaucer, right? This is, we can read this. So this is immediately indicates this is not a medieval book, although it is written by hand and painted by hand. And if we go, I'm showing you now the last page of the book. It's a relatively short book. And down at the bottom, you can maybe make out it says Marie-Louise Pauline de Dalberg Granville, fake it, 1854. So although the book is in English, this inscription is in Latin. It says Marie-Louise Pauline de Dalberg Granville made this book, fake it, and it gives the date 1854. So many medieval books have this kind of thing in them, is signed and dated. It would be nice if the Poissy Processional had it. It doesn't. This book is signed and dated 1854. If we look at this book, I'm showing you 2 pages, and most of the pages in this book look like either of these two. And just to show you now, I'm now juxtaposing the page on the left with a book from 1400. You can actually see these borders are not totally unlike the borders in the Poissy Processional. So although the page on the left was painted in 1854, it's very, very close in form to this French book from around 1400. And likewise, the page on the right, 1854, this is very close to another medieval type of border from about a century later. So we're looking at a book that, although it is made in the middle of the 19th century, is very, very, it knows a lot about the Middle Ages. So that's, that's interesting, although not too surprising. The Middle Ages was greatly prized in the 19th century. If you think of the British Houses of Parliament, for example, are built in the Gothic style, even though they're built in the 1840s. So this would be a not unknown example of a 19th century Victorian English interest in the Middle Ages. This fits in some ways with, we know who Marie-Louise Pauline de Dalberg-Granville was. She was a sort of minor European aristocrat, and she was Catholic, and quite strongly Catholic. This photograph of her was taken in Rome, where she went on pilgrimage. Her name is Marie, so Mary, and the book is shot through with images of Mary. This is a very, very, very Catholic book. And again, so this all fits together to kind of, 19th century Catholic wish that we were still in the Middle Ages, let's say. Things get slightly more interesting, though, about halfway through the book, where you come upon this page. And I don't know, I showed details of the images on the right. This is a kind of page that appears in medieval manuscripts, where you get these borders, where you get these little kind of window frames that look out into landscape. And the only unusual thing about this landscape is that you may be able to make out that you see trees, and you can also see, especially at the bottom, a building made out of glass and steel, or glass and iron in this case. And this is a known building. This is the Crystal Palace that was built in London in 1851, something like a giant, it's like a giant greenhouse. And it housed the Great Exhibition, which was the great moment in the 19th century when Britain celebrated its empire and other European empires by bringing in everything. So we've got this very, very Catholic, very, very medieval book that somehow also has images of the Crystal Palace. And this is interesting because the Crystal Palace is usually seen as the birth of modernity in a lot of ways. You can see the building here much more clearly. The building is not ashamed to be made out of glass and cast iron. In fact, it shows off its glass and cast iron ness. And so it's often taken to be the first modern building. And modernity and the Middle Ages typically stand in opposition to each other. And on the right is a quote from a guy named Matthew Digby Wyatt, who was involved in the Crystal Palace, who writes, you can see he writes, to transcribe on vellum and decorate the writings of ancient and modern authors so as to form unique volumes appears to me nowadays little else than a waste of human life. And this, of course, is what the manuscript that I've been showing you is. It's a unique volume. It's on vellum. It has the writings of the ancient and the modern authors. So we've got Digby Wyatt saying, this is a waste of human life. It's everything the Crystal Palace is not. And yet we have an image of the Crystal Palace in this book. Here, I'll just rely on, I'll rely on a piece of research done by a Reed student, in this case, Aaron Guy, who a couple of years ago wrote an interdisciplinary art history and religion thesis on this book. The thesis is absolutely fascinating because of the Catholic nature of this book, vis-a-vis the Protestant nature of English aristocracy and culture at the time, of which the Crystal Palace was the great moment. The Crystal Palace was the prize project of Prince Albert, Victoria's consort, so that it is part and parcel of the British establishment. Catholicism was not part and parcel of the British establishment. Erin made various discoveries, one of which is the book was made, Marie-Louise Pelline de Dalberg Granville was married to Lord Granville, who was the head of the commission that sponsored the Crystal Palace. So in that sense, that solves the mystery of why the Crystal Palace is in this very, very medieval, very, very Catholic book. But it only really begs the question of what is going on. And this, neither Erin nor I, we presented on this at a conference, neither Erin nor I were able to, we haven't yet solved this problem of why you would make this book. It's fine to say, okay, well, she was married to Mr. Crystal Palace himself, but why then do you still make a very, very, very handmade medieval book, a very Catholic book, in order to do what? To taunt your Protestant establishment husband, to pay homage to your Protestant establishment husband? Well, if that's the case, why do you make a medieval book? So these books, as you can see, all have puzzles in them. And this has made them, and I hope will continue to make them, good teaching objects. And I've gone a bit over my time, but that's more or less all that's more or less what I wanted to say to you or show to you. Again, I wish we had the books here. We don't, but I'm happy to now try and answer more questions, again, either about things I said or about more, probably more about things I didn't say. Carrie, are there things in the chat that I might respond to?
So we just got, is there any room for cultural diversity, and specifically for these African-American artists to whom we owe considerable tribute for our collective health and well-being, and are subjects of considerable art history literature? If not, how can we enrich, to the benefit of our Reed College stature, the appreciation of the contributions of artists whose works have come to be esteemed with the greatest visual artists of all time? If, for example, we explore what is attributed to the African continent and other dimensions of the British and European empires beyond the medieval era. Here's a limited example, right? Like Jean-Michel Basquiat, Augusta Savage, Kara Walker, Jacob Lawrence, Gordon Parks, Edmonia Lewis, James Van Der Zee, et cetera, et cetera. Any thoughts on that?
I do. I mean, I have several thoughts. One thing I'll say is that the gift was to buy books, not art. And that was insisted upon by the donors and has been respected by the college. So we don't have the full range of art available to us. We have to have a book. So that's one thing to say. The second thing to say is that while this was a lot of money, it was not anywhere near an infinite amount of money. And Reed has always taken the position that the faculty should sort of be guiding the library's purchases. So I bought books that I could use in my teaching, and I have used these books in my teaching. I mentioned earlier Geraldine Andrzejczyk's collection of artists' books, and because she was collecting artist books from the 20th and 21st centuries, which is what she specializes in, there's simply more possibilities for her. So we do have absolutely African-American artists of all kinds of other underrepresented groups in books Jerry bought more than mine. So Kara Walker in particular, we have a Kara Walker book or a Kara Walker sort of a portfolio. So that's a partial answer to your question. The third answer to your question is that I haven't been engaged. I will be replaced. I doubt very much I will be replaced by a medievalist, partly for the reasons you mentioned. I mean, I think a medievalist has served Reed very well over the past 30 plus years, but I think it is the case that the new faculty member, again, I'm totally uninvolved in this, might well be in another field, and that faculty member will then have access to these funds to collect in that field. And I guess the fourth thing I would say is that while this fund was specifically for books, and this fund is specifically controlled by the department faculty, the college does have a collection, an art collection, and a gallery program. So in some senses, the Cooley Gallery is probably a slightly more likely venue, given the shape of our faculty, for things. So we've had a Kara Walker exhibit. We have an exhibit coming up in the fall that is of contemporary art that was given to the college. And that heavily, that one of the goals in making that exhibition was, one of the goals in soliciting the gift and one of the goals in making the exhibition was to get artists from communities that are underrepresented at Reed. So I think it's a, I guess, and the fifth thing I will say is there is a global, there has been an attempt, and a successful attempt, to bring the relationship between especially Africa, Europe, and the Middle East into medieval studies. And that appears more in my teaching than in the books we can buy. You know, we're limited to what we can buy. But I think there is an actual authentic global Middle Ages now, based partly on trade routes, partly on things like crusades, that has worked to globalize medieval studies, not so much bringing in America, because America was less of a feature, but I think there are global concerns.
William, are you okay to hang around for a few more minutes and kind of
I've got
some kind of questions?
Sure, if there are some.
Wonderful. Okay, great. You know, one suggestion was, you know, might a future faculty member perhaps purchase non-European books? And I think that was going to some of your comments.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, and I, you know, I should say that, you know, I don't think it's entirely an accident that Jerry Andrzejek and I are two of the more senior members of the faculty. I think the notion of books is in some senses ingrained in our lives in ways that some of my younger colleagues, it is not ingrained in their lives, so that Jerry and I use these funds a lot. I think some of our colleagues don't use them at all. So I think there is also there's probably a learning curve, but also a sense about, if you grew up in a digital age, the desire to own a book or to have a book that you can manipulate is perhaps different than it was for me. So I think there is a generational aspect here as well, in terms of who are the book lovers versus the book users.
And we've got a question from Christina. Christina, you want to unmute and ask?
Oh, hey, William.
Hello.
I don't know if you remember me, but I loved your classes. You totally turned me on to manuscripts. And I missed the introduction about why you're retiring. But I honestly, I always think of you as so young. And I graduated in '90 and was one of your first students. And are you going on to do research, or what's the next step for you? I'm actually heartbroken that you're leaving, because I bet that they won't replace you. Well, they won't be able to replace you.
They will replace me with a person. That's kind of you to say. Yes, you know, I like the teaching part of my job, and I like the research and writing part of my job. And I guess that I like the research and writing part these days more than I perhaps like the other part. And I believe I can afford to retire. We'll see. But yeah, I mean, I hope to stay active in the field, and I have projects I'm working on.
So you're not becoming an emeritus professor, or you are an emeritus? How does
I
that
am
work?
an emeritus, but I don't expect to be teaching.
I see.
mean,
Okay.
You know, I could. I mean, yes. So. But thank you for coming, and thank you for saying that.
Oh, I've really enjoyed your lecture today. I wish you could do this every year.
And then we've got another question in the chat. So before Gutenberg, there were also wood block printed books. Are they being considered as part of the collection?
The woodblock printed book. So I will not. The books I showed you, the two manuscripts. I only got 2 medieval manuscripts. We bought at auction. The third one we bought from a dealer. So the prices ranged from I think the modern book cost $17,000 to the manuscript around $50,000. I don't believe you could get a block book, printed book, for anything close to that. I think those are amongst the rarest, absolute rarest of volumes. So I've never, in fact, I don't recall ever seeing a block book on the market. You know, it was a very strange technology. It involved carving wooden blocks, not only with pictures, but with text, which had to be written backwards. So it was a very strange technology and not a particularly successful technology in the long run. So those books are incredibly rare. The other thing I will say is that we're trying to buy books that it makes sense for us to own and that perhaps their physicalness matters. So the block books are very, very, very well studied and reproduced. We have facsimiles. One of the things we can do with our money is spend money on modern reproductions. And we have several block book facsimiles. So I'm not sure it would entirely make sense to buy a block book, even if they were available. And again, I don't recall ever seeing a block book. I mean, I don't follow the market much anymore, but I don't ever recall seeing one, because that would have been desirable. Some of you, many of you probably know my colleague, Peter Partial, who was a great scholar of prints, and especially this interaction of printed image and printed word. And so he would have been very, very interested in a block book in theory, and I don't recall that ever coming up.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for your wonderful questions. And thank you, William. I'm going to pass things over to our wonderful Foster-Scholz Club chair, Barbara West. Barbara,
Okay.
wait.
I'm just going to put in the chat the name of that book I mentioned about the technologies. I don't know if I can I, yes, I can.
That sounds great.
Yeah.